Ambassador Kurt Volker is Executive Director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Previous positions include U.S. Perm Rep to NATO, Principal Deputy Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, responsible for U.S. policy towards NATO, the OSCE, and U.S.-EU relations, Acting Senior Director for European Eurasian Affairs at the NSC, and Deputy Director, NATO Secretary General. Ian Brzezinski is Resident Senior Fellow with the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security and is on the Atlantic Council Strategic Advisors Group. Previous positions include Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy, and Senior Professional Staff Member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He currently heads the Brzezinski Group, which provides strategic insight and advice to both government and commercial clients. And Ian is no stranger to Ukraine. I believe he lived and worked there for 1 or 2 years back in the early 90s, two years. Before Kirk comes up, I'll introduce Ambassador Temuri Yakobashvili again for those who weren't present. He's the founder and president of New International Leadership Institute. He was Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He served as Ambassador to Georgia to U.S., Georgia's Deputy Prime Minister, and State Minister for Reintegration, as well as in various positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And before Kirk comes up, maybe I'll kill a minute or two with a little my substantive comments on this particular panel. So how does one facilitate peace and security in Ukraine and counter Russia's continuing aggression? That's the $64,000 question. With the Minsk process sort of spinning its wheels with virtually no progress due to ongoing Russian violations of its security provisions, the need to rethink or redefine U.S. strategy is both prudent and obvious. I don't sense much optimism stemming from last week's Normandy 4 roadmap meeting outlining this possibility of a roadmap. Time will tell, but it's going to be a tough haul. But for right now, there doesn't appear to be any realistic alternative to Minsk, to the very flawed Minsk process, given the current political realities and political climate in Europe. And Germany and France remain vested, if not especially enthusiastic, about this Minsk process. And even though the U.S. isn't directly involved in Minsk, Minsk definitely informs, I think, and affects our policy. And the next administration will have to spend a lot of time dealing with this flawed process and what to do next. That's just my 2 cents on Minsk, but of course, U.S. strategy goes well beyond Minsk, and this includes our key alliance, NATO. I think one of the most, if not most successful alliances in the history of mankind. And there are few people, if any, who know more about U.S. NATO policy and indeed about NATO than our speakers. With that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Ambassador Yakobashvili. Temuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to see that you are all refreshed and re-energized by coffee, because we are going to talk about very serious issues, which will be, yes, I don't have a control on the microphone. Some other guys have. Yes, better. Thank you. So our panel is called New Realities. And I think that the key word here is new. Because, people like us sitting on this panel and some people sitting in the audience are contemplating what kind of legacy on international arena the new administration will get. And what is new, what are the issues that they have to handle. And in my humble opinion, there is a big new reality. One can argue that it's Syria or the Middle East. I would say absolutely no. Whatever is happening in Syria or in the Middle East, there is nothing new. We have seen failed states. We have seen the conflicts of that sort. You know, we know that if you leave the strategic vacuum, somebody else is going to come and take it, being in ISIS or Russian Federation. I disagree that Russia is declining power on foreign affairs. It's increasing power on the foreign affairs and more visible power on foreign affairs. But what is new in these new realities, beside 4 or 5 failed states in the Middle East, is that largest country in the world with nuclear power attacked largest country in Europe, occupied its territories, annexed parts of its territories, broke the international peace, violated international borders, and is not either contained or properly punished or properly addressed all this mess that it created on the world affairs. That is news. Middle East is not a news story. And you will have probably soon some news stories about collapsing Venezuelan economy if it's not already collapsed. But what is qualitatively new in the realities that new administration will inherit will be called Ukraine. And we all know that when it started, we know it started in Georgia, we know that it never ended in Ukraine. It came to even the United States by hacking the DNC servers and things like that. And we see Russia investing in super left or super right parties in Europe, investing in NGOs, investing in politicians, investing in media outlets, investing in lobbyists. And I cannot call it Russia being declining on the international arena. On the contrary, it's very, up and running. And to address these new challenges, or big new challenge, we have a perfect 2 very knowledgeable experts who have not only an academic point of view on these issues, and difference between academics and practitioners is very big, because academic can be wrong, it's okay. But when practitioner is wrong, then people suffer. So both gentlemen from my left and right are capable to speak from academic perspective, but also have a huge legacy of serving in the government and dealing with real issues in real time. So I am myself very intrigued to hear what they have to say. We start from Ambassador Kurt Volker.
Okay. Thank you, Temuri, and thank you to the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for inviting me here. I think you hit the right note at the very beginning, Temuri, because you said, what's new? And I don't know how many discussions I've taken part in, Ian has taken part in, you've taken part in, about Ukraine over the last couple of years. And it doesn't matter how much you say what needs to be said, nothing changes. Nothing seems to actually change. There is a lack of political will to tackle the issue. And so I'd like to say a couple of things to repeat what's been said, and then also offer a few thoughts looking forward. One of them is, I was here for the Q&A, and I heard a very sharply worded question directed at Steve Pfeiffer, and I couldn't see who was asking, so I hope you're still here somewhere. But my reaction to that is, I know Steve quite well, I know his views, I know he is very supportive of Ukraine and wants to see as much done as he feels as possible. But I also really understand the question, because even if it's not fair to Steve, the point is that when you look at our leaders in Washington and Brussels and Germany, who is doing anything meaningful? We are doing what we are willing to do as opposed to what would be strategically effective. And that means it would be much harder and much riskier and much more involvement, but we have to admit to ourselves that what we are doing is not changing anything. The other thing I would want to say is that the principal reason why people are not doing more to support Ukraine is because of Russia. It is a calculation or a fear or a sentiment that the more we do, the more we run the risk of being in a confrontation with Russia, and we don't want that confrontation, and so we won't do X, Y, or Z. And then Russia understands that, and so just keeps doing what it's doing, knowing that no one is going to really try to stop them in some way. No disrespect or denigration of anything that Steve said about all the steps that he's recommending, and I agree with those steps. I think they are the right thing to do. But I also want to say we have to admit to ourselves it's not working, and it's because of our concern about Russia. So what then do we need to do? I think the answer to that, and this is what I would suggest, is maybe a way of looking at this going forward, especially with a new administration, is we're never going to get Ukraine policy right. We may get our analysis right, but we'll never get our policy right unless we get our Russia policy right. We have to actually figure out, how do we want to deal with the Russia that we have today, led by Vladimir Putin, authoritarian country, aggressive towards neighbors, flouting all international rules. We've got to get that right. And thus far, we have ducked the question, is what I would say. We have not wanted to confront it. Our military has increasingly described it as the biggest strategic threat that we face, focusing in particular on nuclear weapons and the ability of Russia to annihilate us, and therefore raising a level of importance in assessing Russian actions that even if a smaller actor, even acting more aggressively, would not rise to the same level because of the lack of the strategic implications of that. So the military has been raising that. But the political leaders in our country and in Europe are unwilling to confront the consequences of that. And so we've just let this simmer and simmer, maybe with a hope that, well, Russia's economy is going badly, he's going to overextend himself, it's going to cost a lot of money to have these interventions, and so eventually it'll wind down. I think that's a wrong assessment. I think that Putin's calculations are not based on what we would weigh, but based on his own calculations, which are what reinforces his national narrative, his hold on power, his claim to be making Russia great again. And I think with that, he's not going to back down. That means it is important for a new administration to really construct a much more assertive policy based on our own values and interests of defining outcomes that we want to see in Russia's neighborhood, with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Moldova, with Belarus, with NATO, with the EU, with the Balkans, and in global issues where Russia is increasingly trying to play a role, whether it's Syria, Middle East, nuclear nonproliferation, Iran. We need to be staking out our own objectives in these areas, putting the goals in place, our own commitment to those goals, and mobilizing allies around them. That is what I think the test will be for a new administration. At this point, it looks, we don't know what will happen in the election. It looks more likely than not that Hillary Clinton will win. And I would hope that all of you and those of us who have the privilege of speaking here try to work with them to bring that about. I don't see any change happening in the next few months, but perhaps in a new administration with a fresh strategic review, there'll be an opportunity to insert some of that thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Very interesting. I remember discussions in this city when people were asking for smoking gun, how do we know it's Russians? Now I believe we have not only a smoking gun, but smoking aircraft carrier as well. So now we know everything. What we're going to do about it?
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning and to share with you some of my perceptions on what our policy should look like towards Russia and towards Ukraine in the next administration. Let me thank Nadia and Mark-Jan and Roman for organizing this event, and Oris for his kind introduction, and Temuri for his moderating skills. A presidential election is a very good time to take stock of U.S. policy. I think it's a good time to review what are the fundamental objectives that should be guiding our policies, and to kind of take stock of lessons learned from the previous administration or administration's policies. So I'd like to kind of address today maybe four issues. One, to look back and assess how effective our Russia policy has been, including maybe what the next administration should be thinking about doing that's different. Second, to talk just briefly about why Ukraine is both a critical element to our Russia policy, as Kurt outlined, but also to our Europe policy. They're all part and parcel of that bigger vision, the way we address the continent and our interests on that continent. Then I'd like to kind of briefly review our policy towards Ukraine over the last administration, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and then maybe throw out some ideas about what we should be doing in the Paul Mill realm, or what the next administration should consider doing in the Paul Mill realm in relation to Ukraine. I share Kurt's concern about U.S.-Russia policy. When I look back over the last couple of years, you could even go longer, I think it's been profoundly ineffective and has actually enabled, if not encouraged, the increasingly brazen character of Russian military actions, not just towards Ukraine, but elsewhere in Europe. Our sanctions, I believe, have been weak. Our political isolation of Putin and his leadership has been temporal, just as it was after Russia invaded Georgia. Just look at the meetings that Putin regularly has with Western leaders. And our military response to aggression, be it an invasion of Ukraine or harassment of U.S. military ships and aircraft and the harassment of those platforms of other nations, has been passive. So it's not surprising to me that when you look over the last, certainly over the last 2 years, you've seen a steady escalation in brazenness and provocativeness of Russian military conduct. And this is very disturbing to me because it really increases the risk of inadvertent conflict and all the escalatory dynamics that would come with it. Look back at how cautious the invasion of Ukraine was. That was an invasion that was orchestrated in a very limited way in its initial days, so that in the face of real response, pushback, Putin could pull his little green men out and say, I don't know what you're talking about. You move on a couple months later, and you're having a significant increase in mock bombing runs, nuclear bombing runs against the West, including the United States and Canada, the very day NATO held the Wales Summit. And then right after that summit, there was a cross-border incursion into Estonia, snatching a law enforcement officer that led to his imprisonment for some 9 or 10 months in Lubyanka. You had the military harassment and airspace and sea space penetrations of NATO allies and partners. You had the Caliber strikes, cruise missile strikes, against proxies of the United States, the freedom fighters that we're supporting in Syria, struck by Russian forces, no response. Now more recently, Iskander deployments in Kaliningrad, that's a nuclear-capable system. And then, of course, the topic du jour, Russian interference, Russian government interference in our own election. The key challenge for the next administration is going to be how to reverse that trend of provocativeness, because it will continue. And if it continues, the risk of something horrible happening will only increase. So what should we do? The next administration, I think, has to seriously put on the table a strategy to steadily increase pressure on the Russian economy, even if we have to do it unilaterally to drag some West Europeans along. We have to be more robust in our response to Russian aggressive conduct, be it on the high seas or Syria. You know, this is going to have to require prudence, but avoiding the risk of escalation is not preventing it. That's the lesson of the last several years. We're going to have to return more of our forces to Europe. We're going to have to increase security assistance and engagement to those most threatened by Russia, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia. Ukraine. No country is going to have a more profound effect on Russia's evolution as an international actor than Ukraine. If Ukraine is subordinated to Moscow, Moscow remains an empire, its prospects of becoming a democracy are next to none, and you're going to continue to have an aggressive international actor. A Ukraine that is vulnerable and left isolated, it will only whet Putin's revanchist ambitions. An effective Ukraine policy is also an effective and key element of an effective Europe policy. Ukraine's integration to the Euro-Atlantic architecture is key to preventing Europe's division by the reemergence or perpetuation, I would say perpetuation, of a destabilizing gray zone of insecurity or division by hegemony and occupation. So looking back over the last several years of U.S. policy towards Ukraine, a lot of good has been done. I actually think the economic assistance the international community has provided Ukraine has been useful. It may not be enough, according to some of our colleagues, but it's been useful and it's been driven by the United States. It's because of the United States we have sanctions on Russia, and they're staying there. I would argue they're insufficient, but credit should go where credit is due. And our military assistance has been useful, but we can do more. But overshadowing these positive dimensions and successes of U.S. policy toward Ukraine, I think, are three strategic mistakes, at least three strategic mistakes. The first was the U.S. and the West discouragement of Ukraine's resistance to Russia's invasion of Crimea. That sent a terrible signal to the Russians. It let Putin know that we didn't have a stake, we didn't see a stake in Ukraine. And it left Ukraine feeling isolated. Second, denying Ukraine lethal military assistance. We denied Ukraine the ability early in the conflict to impose greater risk and costs on the aggressor. That, for someone, when you're dealing with Putin, only encouraged him to probe further, to push further. It's not surprising. In light of the passivity of what happened in Crimea, he moved in eastern Ukraine. They were sequential events. And I think it's been a mistake for the administration to discourage Ukraine from actively and overtly pursuing its NATO membership. I was really disappointed its goals for NATO membership. I was disappointed to see in the last NATO summit meeting in Warsaw that Georgia and Ukraine had been kind of separated. Ever since the 2008 Bucharest meeting, it had always been a clearly stated objective of NATO to see these two countries enter the alliance as a full member. Not clear when, but that was the vision. The last summit, Ukraine was discouraged from standing with Ukraine toward that objective. I think it was a mistake. It was basically something we gave, it was an award we basically gave to Putin, basically signaling that he can get his way and deny Ukraine its transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So in the Paul Mill realm, looking forward, what can and should be done regarding Ukraine by the next administration? First, we need to leverage the economic weight and advantages the West has against a very weak and weakening Russian economy. And I think the next panel will address how that can be done. With David Kramer there, I'm sure he's going to have a robust set of initiatives. In the Paul Mill realm, we can do the following. We can reanimate U.S. commitment to the vision of a Europe whole and free. The next administration, I hope, will embrace and assist Ukraine's aspirations to join both NATO and the EU. It should publicly endorse, not discourage, the articulation of those objectives. We should use the next summit to underscore the U.S. position. I'm not naive. I don't think we have enough time to convince West Europeans to reanimate the Bucharest Declaration, but it ought to be clear and made clear at that meeting that this is what the United States wants to do. We should develop with Ukraine, if we have to do it bilaterally or with a small group, a roadmap toward NATO membership, and advocate that that roadmap be accepted by NATO, even if it's anticipated that this will be a medium or even long-term undertaking. Third, we should provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. It was well articulated in the last panel what that could include. We need to provide Ukraine the military equipment necessary to defer and defend against Russia's large-scale maneuver force that's been deployed on Ukraine's eastern frontiers. You know, when I was listening to Bill talk about Javelin, you know, there are tow systems in Syria. That's a U.S. system. We're giving more lethal assistance to the rebel groups in Syria than we are giving to Ukraine. That boggles my mind. Fourth, we should expand U.S. operational engagement with the armed forces of Ukraine. We can do more in terms of training. We can also do more in terms of having bilateral and multilateral exercises on Ukrainian territory. It doesn't have to be right on the border of Donbass and Luhansk. There's a lot of space in Ukraine to use. We can operate U.S. intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance platforms over Ukrainian land space and sea space to share more data with the Ukrainians, to give them more situational awareness, to signal commitment to Ukrainian security. And we should do things to integrate elements of the Ukrainian military into U.S. forces. Why not invite a Ukrainian company to deploy with the U.S. Armored Brigade Combat Team that will be arriving in Poland, I think it's in late January, early February, or be part of the U.S. NATO battalion that will deploy to the Slovakia Gap in April. This would demonstrate real solidarity with Ukraine. It would leverage their valuable, unmatched battlefield experience that they have attained defending their country against advanced Russian technologies and tactics. We would gain from that experience. And nothing that I've mentioned this morning would threaten Russian territorial integrity. Let me just close by saying, in the 1990s, we welcomed Ukrainian independence, but we were uncertain about Ukraine's place in Europe. It was only in 2008 when President Bush, like some of my colleagues here, embraced Ukraine's transatlantic aspirations. Bill Taylor was the ambassador in Ukraine at that time. That was the Bucharest summit. We pushed to put Ukrainian membership in NATO as an objective. But since then, the U.S. support has been allowed to fade. A new administration is an opportune time to reanimate the vision of a Europe whole, free, and secure, and one that includes, without ambiguity, a place for Ukraine in NATO and the EU. The next administration should publicly affirm that position and pursue it prudently and deliberately. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for a very detailed deliberation on these issues. Very important. Lessons that I learned is that A, you don't do anything in Bucharest anymore because neither Bucharest Memorandum is working, or, Bucharest Summit in NATO was disaster in certain extent because Germany blocked Ukraine and Georgia. So next time we are going to do something about Ukraine and Georgia, let's not do in Bucharest. Let's choose some other place. Bigger question for me personally is not how much the U.S. administration understands what is happening. I mean, it's their job to understand. And initially, when there was a policy of reset, and when I was talking to senior officials, they were assuring me that they are not naive. Okay, I thought that they were naive. At least now, nobody is naive about Russia unless they are paid by Russians. But even though that you can talk to people at Pentagon, at the White House, the State Department, Department of the Energy, wherever you go, it's CIA, FBI, they will tell you that they know what Russians are doing and they have plans what to do about it. How we can ensure that next administration will do something about it? It's not that Americans don't know what to do. Every single agency, I can assure you, has a plan what to do with Russia. But none of it, or most of it, is not implemented. So what are the guarantees, or what can be done by civil society, media, whoever, to push the next administration to implement something, at least coming from their own agencies? That's my first big question. To you both. Second big question is that we are talking about arming Ukraine, not arming Ukraine. Personally, I think we are already beyond that point. I'm not sure if Ukraine needs javelins anymore. They can produce, and they are already producing, something not worse than javelin, better than TOW missile for sure. But I've never heard something very important that can be very helpful, that instead of allocating $1 billion to give arms to Ukraine, I would say it will be much wiser to allocate $1 billion for cooperation between American military industry and Ukrainian military industry, for joint production and joint cooperation, which will include transfer of some technology, which definitely will include improved governance, the corporate governance on Ukrainian side, talking about fighting corruption, which will embed Ukraine as a long-term partner in military collaboration, will be more open to advanced technologies coming from both sides. And why it's not happening? Why we are only talking about giving training or not giving and not training, or training but not giving?
I'll take your first one, because I think that's really the key question. How do you convince an administration or a European government to get out of the cycle of thinking it's not our problem and we can't do anything about it anyway? Because that's essentially what we have. And no one that I know in the administration would disagree with the assessment of what is happening in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, the annexation of territory, changing borders, tearing up European security. All of that, they would all, oh yeah, that's right, that's right. But when it comes to doing something about it, there's a sense that, well, Ukraine's not ready, or Ukrainians aren't helping themselves, or the Europeans ought to be doing this, it's a European problem, or our involvement will only make it worse, or we can't. It's just a litany of excuses and defeatist logic, which somehow the normal way that you overcome that is people get galvanized because they become afraid or concerned it's going to impact us directly, and so we've got to respond to that. Or as in the 1990s with Bosnia, it becomes embarrassing. And you see all of these people being killed. You see images of concentration camps on European soil. And we say, we've got to do something about that. And the tools are there, and people finally say, yes, we can do this. But in a situation where that degree of embarrassment and shame and direct interest doesn't kick in Syria, which is the most horrific humanitarian crisis in our lifetime since World War II, then it's hard to imagine that kicking in with Ukraine, which is Russia is at least smart about keeping it a low-burning conflict rather than all-out warfare. So it's really hard to see how that happens. As Ian pointed out, the fact of a new administration is an opportunity to try to get a fresh look and try to convince members of an administration coming in, particularly at the political levels, not the expert levels, but the political levels, that they can do things and can be successful, and it is worth doing, and the consequences of not doing that will in fact affect the United States, maybe in indirect ways today, but in even more direct ways tomorrow. So I think it's attacking those pillars of it's not our problem and we can't do anything. We have to flip that for people to see that it actually is our problem and we can do something.
I guess I'd add to Kurt's points is, on the domestic side, getting the U.S. government to act. In some ways, the conditions are great. Look at Congress. It's a bellwether of public attitudes. It's passed unanimously. Basically, anything on Ukraine, you pass unanimously in terms of support, be it economic assistance or lethal military assistance. So the conditions in some ways are kind of ripe. But this administration and its top leaders have balked on that, exerting their right of executive privilege. But that leads us to our election. And if there is anything good about having a close election with these candidates, is that there are battleground states where there are significant Ukrainian-American communities. And you ought to be demanding on those two candidates that they be clear about what their postures toward Ukraine is. Just don't settle for, well, I'm going to be tougher than, or she's going to be, or he's going to, well, we know he's not going to be tougher, but she's going to be tougher. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you're going to consider lethal assistance to Ukraine? Well, hell, President Obama, respectfully, considers lethal assistance to Ukraine every day. Let's make a commitment to that. Will you change U.S. force posture in Europe? Will you reverse the pivot, so to speak? We should be demanding of these candidates specificity and then decide who we'll vote for. For Europe, if you want the Europeans to act, and Kurt really laid it out pretty well, we have to act. Look at the case of Iran sanctions. The United States started not with full European support. We plowed forward. And when Europeans saw, and our allies saw it, coalitions were willing to form, and eventually we had entire institutions, be it NATO or the EU. So a little dose of U.S. leadership, I think, can go a long way. On the industrial front, I think it's a really good idea, and I've been trying to think about what can one do with the Ukrainian defense industry. It's critical. It's one of the key drivers of the Ukrainian economy, and its future will be significantly impacted. That's the future of the Ukrainian economy will be significantly impacted by the future of its defense industry. If it can become a globally integrated and globally competitive entity, one that is an active player in Western markets, that'll be a great driver of growth. And we all know there's a huge amount of technology and innovation that's available in Ukraine. The problem is the conditions there don't exist. As Anders was outlining, there's still a long way to go to create the market environment that'll be conducive or of interest or give confidence to, for example, U.S. defense firms. So my recommendations is that the Ukrainian government ought to take a real hard look at its national defense industrial strategy. I think it has one. I remember seeing one a couple of years ago. I remember being a page and a half. I may be wrong. They may have updated it. But if they haven't, they should have a really comprehensive document, because it is still basically a state-owned entity. And I would suggest, as part of a marketing plan and part of a strategy development effort, pull together some former CEOs from European and U.S. defense firms, pull together some former officials who used to oversee state-owned defense industries in Western Europe or Central Europe, and create a task force that would help define the fundamental principles for a new defense industrial strategy. That would be the way forward. That would bring in good insight, needed insight. Two, would also be a way to get word out about the capabilities that Ukraine has. And Ukraine has a very capable defense industry.
Thank you. One who is closely following on these issues, I can tell you that there was a good initiative when the American government brought delegation to Ukraine, the representatives of major U.S. military industry in Ukraine. So they've seen everything that Ukrainians have, came here and said, no, thank you. And the reason for that, they had no financial incentive to go there and do something. And this, we are talking about multi-billion corporations, so they really have to have an incentive to work with Ukrainians. So unless there is a money for that, nothing going to happen. And I will tell you what will happen if not. What will happen is that China is increasingly interested now in Ukrainian military industrial complex. And other countries, I don't want to go into naming, but you know, some neighboring countries are interested in their space industry. So it's not inaction from American side. It's not only that it will stay corrupted. No, somebody else will take it and use it. So I think it's a time for Q&A. We all understand that pivot to Asia ended up discussing Middle East and Ukraine. So I still don't understand how America can pivot to any direction in the world, being the only superpower. But nevertheless, I'll be glad to collect your questions, and then the panelists will be ready to give an answers or opinions.
Hi, I'm Michael Sveda from the Embassy of the Czech Republic. Thank you very much for an interesting panel. I would like to focus a little bit on the prospect of NATO membership, or I would say non-prospect right now. It's true that in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members, but it's also true that under current situation, it is not realistic to expect that all 28 NATO members will agree with this. Georgians are even, the map for Georgia is blocked by some NATO members, and I cannot see an option for anything moving forward with Ukraine. So what do you think about an idea to offer Ukraine a bilateral defense treaty, just as the U.S. has with Japan or South Korea? Obviously, it wouldn't be the same as NATO membership, but in effect, it would secure Ukraine territory, maybe minus Donbas and Crimea for the time being, and it would give the Ukraine space for development, not fearing any further Russian aggression. Thank you much.
Thank you. I can take you part on the question, and I can tell you when America will occupy Ukraine like occupied Japan and Korea, then we can talk after occupation about special treaties. These were different circumstances, that's what I want to say. Anything short than Article 5, it's a mockery, in my understanding, in my books. It's a placebo. It's not going to help anybody anyhow. I firmly believe that Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO if Ukraine decides to join. Georgia already decided. So the shortcomings today are a result of only one thing. I mean, let's not forget. Sorry to be very blatant. NATO is United States. If Americans want it, it will happen. If Americans don't want it, it will not happen. Everybody else in Europe will follow what Americans will say, because Americans pay for it, as Donald Trump reminded us. So for me, it's very simple. Americans have to make a decision to have this country in NATO, and these countries will be in NATO, and we will see it happening in my lifetime and your lifetime. That's my position. Anything else, you know, this kind of cooperation mechanism, that kind of cooperation mechanism, we've been there. And it's not working. I don't know.
I'd like to add to this, and I agree with some of what you say, but I don't agree with everything here, Temuri. I think that if the U.S. doesn't want something, yes, we can block it at NATO. If we do want something, that doesn't mean we can get it at NATO, because we have to get a consensus of all the member states. And over the course of a couple of decades now, the U.S. ability to call the shots has really diminished, and there's a lot more divergence in strategic thinking among NATO allies, especially Germany, France, and then you can add into that currently Italy, Belgium, Greece, so on. So there's a lot of diversity about what it would take to get a consensus. Now, that being said, I'm going to say a couple things about the question of bilateral framework versus NATO framework and what the NATO framework ought to be. I don't agree, as Temuri does not agree, with the U.S. putting forward a bilateral security guarantee for Ukraine. The reason is not because I don't want to see that guarantee, is because it lets the rest of Europe off the hook. Germany no longer has any responsibility for acting responsibly with respect to Russia and with respect to Ukraine. We can't have a divided security community when it comes to dealing with Russia and its aggression in Europe. We've got to have a united community. So even though it's a harder lift, it is extremely important for the U.S. to try to keep NATO together and to push for a NATO security guarantee for Ukraine, not just an American guarantee. In terms of what it will take to get that, there are a lot of components that need to be put together as a policy for NATO. We did this, Ian and I did this. Ian and I did this in 2002, and I was involved in the effort in 97 and 98, although not as intimately as in 2002. You need to have an outreach to Russia. That is essential both on the merits. We don't want to be in a conflict with Russia. The fact that some of Russia's neighbors want to be free, independent, secure countries should not be a problem for Russia, and we should be pretty clear about saying that we support their rights and aspirations for that. And that's nothing to do with Russia. We want to work together with Russia. It's up to Russia whether it reacts negatively to the successes of its neighbors or not. So we do need a Russia outreach strategy as part of this. Another is we need to tackle head-on the issue of occupied territory. We can't pretend it's not there. We need to reach an agreement with governments, Georgian government, Ukrainian government, Moldovan government, that we support their sovereignty and territorial integrity. In the long run, we want to see them recover those territories, but we insist that it be done peacefully, and we will not support any military action to reacquire those by force, and that NATO would not be implicated in an effort to reacquire those territories by force. And as the Georgian governments both have already done previously and currently, to say that there will be no first use of force to attack and reacquire territory, but they will defend themselves if necessary. That, I think, will help create a line which would allow progress to go forward on membership in NATO, membership in the EU, democratization and democratic reform, economic progress and development, and helping make sure that Western Ukraine or the heart of Georgia become a magnet for the remaining territories, and buy time where Russia's ability to block these states from developing at all would be diminished. So I think we have to create those conditions. And then the final one, and this is what Temuri was getting at, and I think he's right, a clear American commitment to the success of that NATO membership. So I think it should involve a troop presence and advisors in the Ministry of Defense and with the military forces, and provision of equipment and assistance with border controls that the EU could assist with as well, in order to try to create a very robust policy of presence and commitment that would convince our European allies that, okay, the United States is serious about this, so we can afford to contribute as well.
You don't have much time, so I'll defer to
Last question. Yes, sir. Okay, let's collect these questions. 2 questions collected. 2 last.
Thank you. Dirk Mathias and I write on Russian and Ukrainian affairs. I have a question based on Mr. Brzezinski's remarks. You've talked about U.S. leadership, but Europe is going to be key to having an effective response. And I sense a skepticism on your part about continuing support by Germany. Is that the case? What do you see going forward?
Second question. I'm keeping gender balance.
Right, that Russia imposes its influence on every country and every agency. So this makes process of Ukrainian involvement in the process very difficult and very slow. So my question is, how can you help Ukrainian diaspora to establish itself in any agency and in any structure, so to regain the right perception and to regain the position that it should have in the United States? This is the first question. And speaking about Ukraine, I travel to Ukraine very often, and I have collaboration with academia and universities there. And I understand that the fear of Ukrainians to get into different alliances and partnerships with colleagues from Europe and from the United States is due to maybe, I would say, fear of being betrayed, or fear that someone in the United States or in the Europe can take advantage of their weaknesses. So I believe that more educational activities should be expanded to Ukraine, so people will understand that and will be more prepared for those partnerships and collaboration in all initiatives, innovative initiative, in healthcare, in all. So the question is, what can be done in those 2 directions? First, to strengthen the Ukrainian community here, and also to get Ukrainian community in Ukraine involved in partnerships and collaborations.
Thank you. I can give you a very quick answer on your questions. On number 1, Ukrainian, French speaking, very blatant word, French speaking. Stop ethnography, move to politics. Ukrainian diaspora is not largely ethnographic. It's about Sharvari and Vyshivanka. So get organized politically. How to do it? Go and talk to APAC, I don't know, other organizations. They will tell you exactly how to do it. On second issue, education is not enough. You can educate people who will then run out of Ukraine to Europe or to the United States. You have to create incentives for these educated people to stay in the country.
I guess I would say, you know, on the Germany question, I'm actually a big supporter of Merkel. I admire her. I think we're lucky that she's in the Minsk group, and that should have been my fourth strategic failure in the United States. We should be part of the Minsk group. But thank goodness she's there, because I'm not convinced the French would be holding as tough a line in that process if she wasn't there. Should she be pushing for more? Yeah, I would like it if the Germans were a little bit tougher on sanctions, but in fact, she's the one who's pushing for possible sanctions on Syria. But we got to remember that Germany is still an evolving power and is very cautious, and maybe as a Polish American, I'm a little bit appreciative of that cautious, about being overbearing in Europe. So the main problem, or the main impediment, I would say, to a tougher European line on Russia is a little less Germany and more the United States. If the United States would lean tougher, we'd get most Europeans following us. On the Ukrainian impact in the United States, I think it's actually hats off to this community. I just look back at Congress and the amount of legislation that's been passed over the last couple of years in support of Ukraine. I mean, it hasn't even been debated. It's almost boring because it's all UC'd. It's unanimous in the House and in the Senate. That's real impact. I can't think of more bipartisan pressure on an administration than getting Republicans and Democrats in this time and day to stand up and say, we need more economic assistance for Ukraine. We need to provide better military assistance to Ukraine. So my hat is off. And then the last point on exchanges in education, we're in an age where we have to completely think about how we reach out and engage the next generation of peoples around the world. We did this during the Cold War. We had intensive engagement, student exchanges, cultural programs, scientific exchanges, radio and information, and we're not doing it. So what you mentioned is an important part, but not the only part. It has to be massively ramped up. Otherwise, we're going to be beaten by the likes of troll warriors in Moscow or small non-state acting trolling organizations, be it ISIS and other extremist groups.
Thank you. Congress can do more, namely not only talk about it, but give money for it. Not only allowing President to give to Ukrainians lethal weapons, but allocating money for it. Thank you, panelists, and please join me, you know how to thank